If you've made it this far, you already know. You already feel it. You're not like the others. Not because you chose to be different, but because you refuse to lie to yourself. You don't look away when things get uncomfortable. You don't pretend the world is better than it is. You don't numb your mind to fit into small conversations or shallow truths. And that makes life harder, more lonely, more complicated. But it also makes you real. In a world full of echo chambers and empty validation, your presence is rare. Your insight is rare. Your pain is the price of clarity. But don't let that pain become bitterness. Let it become a compass. Let it guide you, not isolate you, because someone, somewhere, is waiting to hear exactly what you're afraid to say, waiting to feel what you're tired of carrying alone. The truth you hold might be the very thing that sets another soul free. And even if no one claps, even if no one agrees, even if they laugh or turn away, hold your line, because that line is the edge between sleep and awakening, between pretending and becoming, between surviving and living with eyes open. Schopenhauer never saw the world change, but his words survived. So will yours. Your questions matter. Your silence matters. Your refusal to settle matters. So don't dim your fire to make others feel safe in the dark. Stand. Speak. Let the silence prove you right. And remember, the world doesn't fear your mind because it's wrong. It fears your mind because it's right. So tell me, what truth have you been afraid to say out loud? The ones who see too much are the ones who lead us forward. No one tells you this growing up. They teach you to be smart, to ask questions, to think for yourself. But they never tell you what happens when you actually do. Because when you start seeing through things, when you stop nodding and start noticing, you begin to lose people. You're no longer invited into every conversation. Not because you're rude, but because your presence feels like a spotlight in a room full of shadows. You make people uncomfortable, not by attacking them, but by existing with eyes wide open. And that's the first punishment of intelligence. Loneliness. Not the poetic kind, not the kind that artists romanticize. The real kind, the cold kind, the kind that echoes, the kind that creeps in when you're surrounded by people, but no longer with them. Imagine being the only sober person at a party. Everyone else is laughing, dancing, cheering, and you're just watching, not judging, just noticing. The absurdity, the chaos, the emptiness behind the performance. You try to speak, try to say what you see, but they don't hear insight. They hear disruption. They hear you ruining the mood. So you go quiet, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. This is what Schopenhauer meant by the burden of consciousness. He said the more aware you become, the more isolated you feel. Because awareness separates. It divides those who question from those who conform. And most people choose comfort over clarity. Society rewards intelligence only when it conforms, only when it entertains. But the moment it challenges comfort, questions values, breaks illusions, it becomes dangerous. You become too much, too intense, too serious, too analytical. They won't say it out loud. They just stop calling, stop listening, start labeling. And here's the cruel irony. You didn't ask for this distance. You only asked for honesty. You only asked, what if we're wrong? What if this doesn't make sense? What if there's more? But those questions are dangerous, not because they're offensive, but because they're real. And real questions destroy fragile illusion. It's easier to mock the thinker than to question the thought, easier to exclude than to reflect. Easier to call someone pretentious than to admit you've never thought that deeply before. And so the intelligent person learns to carry two weights, the weight of knowing and the weight of knowing. They can't share it freely. Schopenhauer lived this pain. He wrote with clarity, with depth, with honesty, and the world turned away. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too right. Because he didn't flatter the ego, he revealed it. He didn't worship comfort, he questioned it. And that made him dangerous. He saw that people prefer beautiful lies over painful truths. They prefer stories with heroes and happy endings, where good always wins and meaning is guaranteed. But intelligence doesn't operate in stories. It operates in reality. And reality is rarely beautiful. It's messy. It's chaotic. It's uncertain. And when you refuse to simplify it, when you choose to see, you walk alone. But that solitude is not a curse. It's a crucible, because inside that silence, inside that space of being misunderstood, you grow something no one can take from you. Clarity, depth, wisdom. So if you've ever been the one sitting quietly, watching the world pretend, if you've ever felt like the only one awake in a room full of sleepwalkers, know this: you are not broken. You are not wrong. You are simply awake. And yes, awakening is lonely, but it is also the beginning of everything that matters. There's something deeply unsettling about a mirror, not the kind made of glass, but the kind made of awareness, a person who reflects not what you want to see, but what you've been hiding from your entire life. Society fears that kind of person, not because they're violent, not because they're loud, but because they reflect what others are terrified to face. They don't attack. They don't insult. They don't even try to expose. They simply exist, with too much clarity, too much presence, too much truth. And in doing so, they make others feel exposed. You see it all the time. Someone speaks with piercing honesty. The room goes quiet. People shift in their seats. They laugh nervously, change the subject, check their phones, not because what was said was wrong, but because it was too right. That's the threat of the truth teller, not in their voice, but in their vision. They don't disrupt the world with noise. They disrupt it with silence, with stillness, with the kind of observation that turns comfort into discomfort, because people don't want to be confronted. They want to be confirmed. Schopenhauer called this the world of appearances, where everything is surface, polished, filtered, where reality is edited to protect the ego. We live in myths, stories, cultural hallucinations we agree to call truth. We say everything happens for a reason, that good things come to good people, that love always wins. But underneath, we know life is indifferent. Justice is not guaranteed. And love, more often than not, is survival disguised as poetry. Most people don't want to hear that, because if it's true, then everything they've built their identity around starts to tremble. It's easier to ignore the cracks in the foundation than to rebuild the house. And so, society punishes the mirror. It mocks the philosopher. It silences the truth teller. Not because they're wrong, but because they make everyone else feel naked. And yet, the irony is, society needs them. Because without reflection, we rot. Without confrontation, we stagnate. Without clarity, we decay inside the illusion of growth. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote that power lies in perception. Whoever controls the narrative controls the people. And truth, it's a threat to every carefully built lie that makes the world run smoothly. So what does society do? It creates defense systems, not with walls, but with ridicule, dismissal, exclusion. They call you arrogant, pessimistic, elitist, too cold, too deep, too much. Not because it's true, but because it's easier than facing the reflection you hold. This is the tragedy of being the mirror. You love too deeply to pretend. You care too much to lie. And because of that, you're cast out. But make no mistake, you're not being rejected for being wrong. You're being rejected for being right too soon. And one day, those who flinched will remember what you said. Not as insult, but as warning. Not as arrogance, but as prophecy. So, hold the mirror steady. Even when their eyes turn away. Even when their words turn sharp. Because someone, somewhere, will be brave enough to look. And when they do, they'll thank you. Not for making them feel good, but for making them feel real. There comes a moment. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It creeps in, quietly, slowly, until one day, you wake up, and everything you once believed starts to feel like a lie. You stop believing in innate endings, in the fantasy that things always work out, in the story that if you work hard, stay kind, follow the rules, life will reward you, because you've seen too much, and what you've seen can't be unseen. You notice the forced smiles, the empty words, the rituals of modern life that go nowhere but keep everyone busy pretending. Wake up, go to work, buy things, perform, repeat, call it purpose. But deep down, a whisper. This isn't it. This can't be what we were made for. And when you say that out loud, people look at you like you're the problem, like you broke something sacred. But you didn't break anything. You just stopped pretending. This is the second punishment of intelligence. Disillusionment. It sounds elegant, but it cuts deep. Because disillusionment isn't the absence of hope. It's the death of false hope. And that death hurts. It's like watching your favorite childhood movie again. But this time, you see every flaw, every lie, every cheap trick the story used to keep you sedated. Everyone else still claps at the ending. You just sit in silence. Not to ruin it, but because you can't play along anymore. Schopenhauer called this the burden of consciousness. The more you see, the more you carry. You carry the contradictions, the fragility, the shadows behind people's eyes. You see how close we are to breaking, even while pretending to be strong. You see the sadness behind ambition, the fear behind kindness, the hollowness behind most success. And that doesn't make you cynical. It makes you honest. But honesty is heavy, because people don't want the world as it is. They want the world as they wish it were. And when you refuse to lie, they call you negative, pessimistic, dark. Not because you are, but because you reflect what they hide. So you become quiet, selective, distant, not to be mysterious, but to protect your inner fire from being drowned by shallow noise. You crave deeper conversations, but all you hear is surface talk. You crave meaning, but the world hands you distraction. And slowly, you wonder if maybe you're broken. Maybe ignorance is bliss. Maybe awareness is a curse. But it's not, because while others chase comfort, you chase clarity. While others seek applause, you seek truth. And that is the beginning of liberation. Machiavelli once wrote, "Men are driven by two things, fear and interest. But when you're no longer afraid of seeing clearly, and no longer interested in playing along, you become something different. something rare, something free. And freedom, real freedom, starts when illusion ends. Yes, the truth can be harsh, but it's real. And once you taste reality, you realize you were never really living when you were believing the lie. So let the illusions fall. Let the masks crack. Let the story unravel. Because truth, even when it hurts, is the only ground stable enough to stand on. The only mirror that doesn't lie back to you. And once you can stand in front of that mirror without flinching, without apologizing, without needing approval, that's when you stop being afraid. That's when you stop surviving. And finally, start living. You don't need to raise your voice to start a revolution. You don't need to hold a sign or light a fire. Sometimes rebellion is quiet. Sometimes it looks like someone thinking for themselves. Independent thought. It sounds noble, but in practice, it terrifies people, not because it's dangerous, but because it reveals how fragile our world really is. Society doesn't run on truth. It runs on agreement. We agree this piece of paper has value, so we call it money. We agree these invisible borders exist, so we call them countries. We agree certain behaviors are normal, so we call them good. But what happens when someone stops agreeing? What happens when someone looks at all these rules and says, "This doesn't make sense"? They ask, why do we spend 40 years working jobs we hate? Just to buy things we don't need? To impress people we don't even like? Why do we accept a world where some have billions, while others have nothing? Why do we pretend that fitting in is more virtuous than thinking clearly? These questions don't just challenge the system, they unravel it. Because behind every agreement is a collective illusion. And once one person says, "I no longer believe," the illusion starts to crack. And that's terrifying. Because most people don't build their lives on truth. They build them on comfort. And comfort isn't built to withstand scrutiny. So when someone challenges that comfort, they become a threat. Not because they're aggressive, but because they're honest. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote that anyone introducing new ideas must be prepared to be hated by those who benefit from the old ones. Independent thought isn't a virtue to society. It's a disruption. Because it asks for more than obedience. It asks for awareness. And awareness leads to accountability. And accountability breaks the spell. So what does society do? It pushes back. Not with reason, but with ridicule. With silence, with rejection. You'll be called difficult, too deep, too critical, too sensitive, too much of everything that threatens the balance they never questioned. And over time, you start to shrink. Not because you want to, but because every honest word feels like a punch to their illusion. And you're tired of being treated like a weapon when you only wanted to speak the truth. But here's the thing. You don't have to be loud to lead. You don't have to argue to resist. Every time you choose clarity over comfort, every time you ask why, when silence would be safer, you're rebelling. Not to destroy, but to awaken. And that's the power of the silent rebellion. It doesn't burn cities. It burns illusions. It doesn't scream. It sees. And the more clearly you see, the more uncomfortable the world becomes. But discomfort is where growth begins. So if the world calls you too much, wear it. Because someone out there is choking in conformity, and your voice might be their first breath of air. It's easy to think of danger as something physical. A raised voice, a clenched fist, a dark alley. But sometimes, danger is subtle. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It looks like a calm person asking a hard question. It feels like someone seeing through your story before you're ready to rewrite it. And that can be terrifying. Because when someone challenges your beliefs, they're not just debating an idea, they're touching your identity. We don't defend our opinions. We defend who we think we are. And the body reacts, not the intellect. The body, heart rate spikes, adrenaline flows, muscles tighten, fight or flight. You felt it. Someone says something true, too true, and your chest tightens. Your defenses rise. Your face grows hot. Not because they insulted you, but because they exposed you. Schopenhauer understood this before psychology gave it a name. He saw that people don't fear intelligence. They fear the reflection it forces them to face. And when that reflection doesn't match the story they've told themselves, they panic. Because identity is sacred, and questioning it feels like violence. That's why intelligent people are often met with resistance, not for being cruel, but for being clear. They don't argue, they observe. And that observation feels like judgment, because they notice when your words don't match your tone, when your smile carries tension, when your beliefs are just borrowed lines. They don't mean to confront you, but their presence holds up a mirror, and most people aren't ready to look, so they attack, or they vanish, or they call you intense, overthinker, too cold, too sensitive. It's not really about you. It's about what you represent. An invitation to be honest. And honesty hurts. Because most people aren't living lies on purpose. They're surviving them, clinging to them, trying to keep the world stable by keeping their truth buried. So when you arrive and unintentionally dig it up, you become the villain. Not because you meant harm, but because you meant truth. And truth, when unexpected, feels like betrayal. This is emotional combat. But only one side knows it's happening. You're trying to connect. They think you're confronting. You're sharing a thought. They feel attacked. You're searching for meaning. They hear criticism. So what happens? You stop speaking. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. You edit your words, soften your edges, swallow your questions, because you're tired of being misunderstood, tired of feeling like a storm in every room you enter. But here's what matters. Your clarity is not the problem. Your sensitivity is not the threat. Your questions are not weapons. They are doors. Doors most people aren't ready to open. But someone is. Someone is waiting to feel less alone in a world full of masks. And your voice might be the key. So don't stop thinking. Don't stop asking. Don't stop seeing. Just learn when to speak and when to walk away. Because not every battle needs to be fought. But your truth, it still deserves to live. Arthur Schopenhauer, didn't he a celebrated man? There were no crowds. No fame, no legacy in his own time. He died misunderstood, ignored, alone, not because his ideas were foolish, but because they were too honest. He said love is mostly biology. Free will is mostly illusion. And most of what we call morality is fear dressed up as virtue. He didn't flatter the ego. He exposed it, and people hated him for it. That is the curse of intelligence. Not rejection, but misunderstanding. Not because you don't speak clearly, but because what you say doesn't match what they want to hear. You say, success doesn't guarantee happiness. They hear, you hate ambition. You say, most relationships are built on projection. They hear, you don't believe in love. You say, Maybe our values are convenient illusions. They hear. You have no ethics. They don't hear you. They hear their fear. And in that fear, they reduce you to a label, to a threat, to something small enough to ignore, because it's easier to dismiss the person than to sit with the discomfort they create. This is the weight of being truly awake. You say things that others feel, but can't articulate. You notice what they ignore. You speak what they suppress. And in return, you're misunderstood. Again, and again, and again. It's not just frustrating. It's painful. Because all you wanted was to connect. Not to provoke. Not to dominate. But to share something real. But the deeper your truth, the lonelier it feels. Because the more you reveal, the more others retreat. Not because they don't care, but because they're not ready. And over time, you start to protect yourself. You censor. You shrink. You pretend. Not to deceive, but to survive. Because every conversation feels like walking through a minefield. You never know when honesty will be taken as attack, when clarity will be called arrogance, when depth will be punished as being too much. So you isolate, like Schopenhauer, not because you hate people, but because you ache for something deeper and can't find it. You live in a world of thoughts, unspoken, unshared, heavy, but even in solitude, you stay loyal to your vision, because what you see is real, and real is worth carrying, even if it's misunderstood, even if it costs you connection, even if it costs you applause, because clarity, without recognition, is still clarity, and time always catches up to truth. Schopenhauer's writings were ignored for most of his life, but today, they shape psychology. They shaped Freud. They shaped Jung, because real ideas don't disappear. They wait for the world to be ready. And so do you. You don't need to be understood by everyone, just by those who matter. You don't need approval to be real. You only need courage to keep seeing. So hold your truth, even when it isolates you, even when it echoes in silence. Because the misunderstood are often the ones pointing toward a future others haven't imagined yet. People often mistake solitude for superiority. They see the quiet one in the room, the one who doesn't speak much, doesn't laugh at every joke, doesn't join every conversation, and they assume he thinks he's better. She's too proud. They're just full of themselves. But what they don't see is the ache, because isolation doesn't always come from ego. Sometimes it comes from frequency, speaking a language too few understand, feeling things most people don't have names for. You walk into a room and everyone's talking about sales, trends, distractions, and you're thinking about time, mortality, meaning. So you go quiet, not out of judgment, but because you can't pretend to care about things that feel empty. Intelligence isn't a pedestal. It's often a prison, one built not of arrogance, but of longing. Longing for connection that isn't shallow, for conversations that don't feel rehearsed, for relationships that don't require a performance. You crave depth, but you're surrounded by surfaces. And every time you try to go deep, people flinch. They back away. They misread your intensity as hostility. You're not trying to overpower. You're trying to reach. But your questions scare them. Your honesty threatens them. Your clarity makes them feel uncertain. And so you learn to translate your thoughts into something softer, simpler, safer. You start performing, not to deceive, but to survive. You become a version of yourself they can accept, while your full self stays hidden. And it hurts, because you're not trying to be mysterious. You're trying to be understood. And the more you hide, the lonelier you feel. Schopenhauer knew this ache. He didn't withdraw because he thought he was better. He withdrew because he saw too clearly to enjoy pretending. He wasn't cold. He was real. And the world wasn't ready for that. And maybe neither is yours. So you retreat into books, into thought, into silence. Not because you've given up, but because you're tired of shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. You don't want to dominate. You want to resonate. You're not seeking attention. You're seeking recognition, not applause, but alignment. Someone who hears you and says, "Yes, I see that too." But that kind of connection requires depth on both sides. And most people aren't swimming. They're floating. So your depth feels like danger. Your presence feels like pressure. And your need for meaning feels like an accusation. But let me be clear. Your depth is not the problem. Your need for truth is not too much. Your ache for the real is not a flaw. It's proof that you're still alive in a world that keeps asking you to go numb. So stop apologizing for needing more. Stop shrinking so others don't feel small. Stop pretending that silence means arrogance when it really means ache. Because someone out there is drowning in shallowness and waiting to meet someone like you. Someone who speaks in full sentences. Who feels fully. Who dares to say, "This is what I really think. This is what I really feel." And when you meet them, you'll remember why you never gave up. You'll remember that isolation wasn't your punishment. It was your preparation. Most people spend their entire lives perfecting a mask. A version of themselves designed not for truth, but for approval. We learn it early. Smile when it's polite. Nod when it's easier. Speak in tones that won't make waves. Dress the part. Play the role. It's not deception. It's survival. We don't show who we are. We show what works. What gets applause. What keeps us safe. But then, someone walks in, and they don't respond to the mask. They look straight through it, and suddenly, you feel exposed. Not attacked, not insulted, just seen. And for most people, that's terrifying, because we don't fear being wrong. We fear being visible, in our contradictions, in our confusion, in our roughness. That's what intelligent people often do. Not intentionally, but naturally. Their minds notice the mismatch between words and energy, between smiles and silence, between image and essence. They're not judging, they're just observing, but their observation feels like invasion. Because when you've worn a mask for too long, even kindness feels like threat. So what happens? People flinch. They pull away. They lash out. Not because you harmed them, but because your presence revealed what they were hiding, and they weren't ready to see it. Schopenhauer understood this. He saw that people avoid intelligence not because it's confusing, but because it's penetrating. It sees past the performance. It speaks what others only whisper. It walks straight toward what most run from. And that kind of clarity doesn't feel comforting. It feels like being stripped, because truth exposes everything the mask was built to protect. The insecurity, the doubt, the fear of not being enough. And instead of saying, "Thank you for seeing me," they say, "You make me uncomfortable." So they call you negative, too analytical, too deep, too cold, too much. Not because you are, but because they've spent their lives avoiding their own reflection. And you are a mirror, not a perfect one, but a real one. You didn't ask to hold that role, but your presence holds up a truth they're not ready for. So you learn to soften, to edit, to withdraw, not out of fear, but out of fatigue, Because unmasking others is not your mission. It's your side effect. A side effect of living in awareness when others still live in roles. And the cost is being misunderstood. Again and again. But don't let that shame you. Your clarity is not cruelty. Your perception is not pride. It's the language of depth. And not everyone speaks it. But someone does. Someone is waiting to be seen without flinching. To be heard without filter. To be loved without mask. And when your truth meets their readiness, the unmasking becomes grace, not exposure. Until then, carry your clarity with humility, with strength, with patience, because the world doesn't need more masks. It needs more mirrors, held gently by those brave enough to see without turning away. There comes a moment, no spotlight, no applause, just silence. It's the moment you realize no one's coming with you. Not because they don't care, not because they're against you, but because they don't see what you see. And now you have a choice. Stay, blend in, pretend, nod along, keep the peace, or walk forward, alone, into the unknown, into the storm, into the fire of your own truth. This is the final cost of seeing clearly. You lose company to gain integrity, because the further you go into honesty, the fewer people can follow. Not because you're better, but because the path gets narrow. Schopenhauer walked it. So did every thinker who chose truth over popularity. They weren't praised. They were pushed aside. Because truth isn't celebrated while it's still inconvenient. It only becomes wisdom once the world catches up. And until it does, you walk alone. But that solitude is not weakness. It's the crucible where real leaders are forged. Not leaders of people, but of vision, of soul, of unseen paths. The truth teller doesn't walk in front to be admired. They walk in front because they must. Because the crowd is still clapping for illusions. Still building comfort on sand. Still worshipping safety over sanity. And you saw the cracks. So you left. Not in bitterness, but in honesty. Because staying meant betraying what you knew. And even if no one understands, you still walk. Not for approval, but for alignment. Machiavelli said, "You must be willing to act alone if you wish to act with power." And what greater power than living in truth when everyone else is living in role play? This is not arrogance. It's responsibility. You are not above the crowd. You are ahead of it. Not better, just earlier. And one day, they may join you. They may remember the things you said when they were still too afraid to listen. They may say, "I didn't get it back then, but now I do." And that's when you'll know your solitude was not a waste. It was leadership in silence. So walk on, even when it hurts, even when your voice shakes, even when you have to carry what others refuse to see. Because someone has to go first. Someone has to hold the light. Someone has to ask, what if we're wrong? What if we could be more? You don't need their applause. You need your own peace. And if peace costs popularity, so be it. Because you were never born to echo. You were born to originate. If you've come this far, it means you already know. You already feel it. You've carried thoughts you couldn't share. You've asked questions no one wanted to answer. You've felt the ache of seeing too clearly in a world built to look away. And that ache is not weakness. It's your compass. Because in a world that teaches you to shrink, to stay small, to agree just to belong, you chose to remain awake. You chose silence over pretending, clarity over comfort, truth over approval. And that choice cost something, It costs applause. It costs belonging. Sometimes, it costs love. But what it gives you cannot be bought. It gives you depth. It gives you peace. It gives you the quiet strength to face yourself without flinching. Because at the end of the day, you don't need to be understood by everyone. You need to be true to yourself. You don't need everyone to walk with you. You just need the courage to keep walking anyway. So if you've ever felt like you think too much, feel too deeply, care too honestly, you're not broken. You're not alone. You're just awake in a world that's still dreaming. And your role is not to fall asleep. It's to carry the light, even if your hands shake, because someone out there is watching, listening, hurting, and your truth might be the first voice that makes them feel seen. So don't dim your flame to make others feel safe in the dark. Don't apologize for carrying questions that others hide from. Don't walk away from the path you were born to follow. The world may not thank you now, but one day they will remember not what you wore, not how loud you were, but that you saw what others refused to see, and you spoke anyway. And that is enough. Now ask yourself, what truth have you been holding back? And who might need to hear it